Hi everyone! I'm going to share the 5 things I learned from my first open source contribution. My name is Andrea, I'm a technical writer and an open source enthusiast. I've been working on an open source project as part of my job, but I'm also trying to maintain a habit of contributing to open source projects outside of work. I call this my first proper open source contribution because it's my first contribution to a project that's not a work project. So for the first time, I was contributing to a project whose maintainers I did not know. For all intents and purposes, they were strangers. They were not people I knew from stand-up. They were not people I would go for beer with after work. So it was all a very different experience, but a very sort of like rewarding experience. And I would very much like to share what I've learned from it. I find it's very important to contribute to something you care about, and to give yourself the mental space to work on the contribution. Communication is hard in general, and there are some interesting particularities about communication in the open source space. Asking for help is also important, and sooner or later we all end up having to do that. And I will wrap up today's talk with a reflection on the value of open source contributions from a personal and a community perspective. Contributing to something you care about. Why is this important? It's important to care about the contribution you want to make, because then your motivation will be coming from within you. It will not be something external pressuring you to take it to completion, but it'll be you holding yourself accountable for making the thing happen because you want to. And research shows that that actually makes you more likely to complete it. So how nice is that? In terms of my contribution, what I really cared about was middleman. So this is a tool I used to use for work. It's a static site generator written in Ruby, open source, of course, with a community of over 25,000 users over on GitHub. Now, the thing I particularly cared about was that middleman generated alt text automatically based on the file name. Now, why is this a problem? Let's unpack that statement a little bit, because it's quite dense. So let's start by reviewing what alt text is. So alt text is the value of the HTML alt attribute, which provides an alternative description for an image if the image cannot show up. If the user cannot see the image. And that can be because the image cannot show up, because the internet is slow, the connection is slow, or the user might not be able to see the image because of a visual impairment, for example. This is what HTML looks like in terms of alt attribute and alt text. And alt text is also something you can specify in Markdown. It's the text that goes between the square brackets when you insert your image. Now, do I always need to have alt text in there? The answer is you always need to have an alt attribute, but the alt attribute may have an empty string as its value. So this is not the most common situation, but if your image is decorative, or if your image is described and explained elsewhere in the main text, then you do not need to have alt text. And if you think of technical documentation, that's something that we often do. We explain an image in the main text, and this sort of approach benefits all types of users. And because of that, it doesn't need the information does not need to be repeated in the alt text. So empty alt text is something we do quite a lot. Now, looking at how middleman handles alt text. If there is text specified in the square bracket, that goes over to the value of the alt attribute. However, if the square brackets don't have a value in there, the alt attribute takes as value the file name. Now, that is something I found very surprising and shocking for two reasons. First of all, this would generate unhelpful alt text for end users. So if you can't see an image, and the description you get for the image is image 001 or logo or a file name, that is not an appropriate description of what the image represents in context. And also from the second reason, from the perspective of a middleman user, so someone building websites with middleman, I did not expect those empty square brackets to generate any alt text at all. So there it is. That was my motivation. And from that motivation, I formulated my contribution, which was some way of changing the way middleman handles alt text so that end users would not end up getting unhelpful automated alt text in this way. And the second benefit would be that people building websites with middleman would have a transparent way to handle alt text. Now, in general, in terms of getting started with open source contributions, where does one start, right? So there are several starting points, and you might want to go around, explore, and see what best works for you. The issues section of your favorite open source projects would be a good starting point. The open source channel on the WriteTheDoc Slack has a lovely community of more than 400 people who are generally very good chat around open source topics. There are also Docathon or Writing Day type events at conferences, for example. There's also Google's Season of Docs or Hacktoberfest. Just a couple of examples of events out there focused around stimulating contributions to open source. Now, moving to the second point, on the mental space and support and their importance for open source contributions. So it's absolutely crucial to take your time when working on your contribution, because contributing takes up time. It takes concentration. You need to learn about the new project. You need to figure out the contribution guidelines, and then you need to translate your contribution in terms of what that project expects, how that project is formulated, and this all takes time. And it's important to allocate that for yourself. Now, in terms of my little middleman contribution, I had to first understand the automatic alt text feature, like how come it was there to begin with. I would have to explore the code base and understand how the feature is implemented. And then once I understood that, figure out how to remove it or how to change it. Now, the first thing I did was head over to the middleman repository and do a search for alt text, alt attribute. And I found this issue from back in 2013, which answered a lot of my questions around how come the feature came about. And the answer is that someone from the middleman community saw that the Rails community does this automated alt text thing, which looked cool. So how long did it take me? Like, how much time did I have to allocate to do all this background research? And my answer is that I couldn't possibly tell you. It's something I did in bits and bobs here and there. I would do it while waiting for my train on the platform. I would browse through social media, and then it's like, oh yeah, there's that middleman thing I've been thinking about. Let's head over to GitHub, and then I would try and read some code on my phone screen. It's not the best approach, but that's how I cobbled together this project that was at the back of my mind for quite a long time, actually. So yeah, finding the time and properly allocating the time as opposed to just the layover between your trains would be a good start. It's also good to mention it to colleagues, to friends, because they'll generally be quite supportive, and it'll give you a little boost to carry on. And another idea there. So if you find that you're interested in contributing to software that is related to or that you're using at work, it might be worth mentioning it to your manager, because companies often like to invest in and sponsor open source projects, and this might be a way for you to do it and get the time to do it. Now, communicating with people you've never met. Talking to people, it can be very intimidating. And it's even harder when you don't know the people, when you can't see the people, you can't see their gestures. I mean, we've all lived through a good few months, almost a year of pandemic now. So we all know what that's like. Concerns around getting your point across, being misunderstood, being wrong, how to navigate all of this. Now, in my particular case, the big question was, how do I explain the change that I want to the middleman community? I want to remove a feature they have introduced. I want to delete someone's code. Someone spent time writing a feature and I want to remove it. How do I do this without antagonizing the community? How do I do this in a positive way? How do I frame this? How do I go about it? So then what I did was to try and understand even more about how the feature was introduced and try and really empathize with the developers who introduced this feature. So I went back to the issue that said it would be really nice to have alt text. And indeed, back in 2013, inspired by Rails, the general mood around introducing it was positive. People thought it sounded cool, nice, foresighted, and developers love automation. I love automation just as much, and I understand the appeal of it. It's just that after more discussion around accessibility and user needs and things, it turns out that this is not the place to apply automation. In any case, of all these hints, I decided to look into the Rails community a bit more and see how come they decided to add this feature. Now, I didn't find, or maybe I didn't search hard enough, but the first thing I found in the Rails repository was this issue saying that automatically generated alt text can be harmful for screen reader users. Now, this to me was a massive revelation, right? Because it turns out that there is someone else out there who reached the same conclusion I did for the same issue, but with a different community. And it also turns out that the issue they raised resulted in a code change. That means that the Rails community now does not generate alt text automatically. So, the very inspiration for the middleman feature is not there anymore. So this was going to be a really strong argument for my change. Okay, now let's write that issue. So I was particularly careful to write a comprehensive issue, fully describing the background, making sure that they know that I know how the feature was introduced and that I understand that it was introduced with the best of intentions. But in the meantime, with discussions around accessibility, even the original inspiration for the automated alt text feature decided to remove it because it was unhelpful for end users. And I also added a couple of other sections explaining why file names are not good alt text and why middleman users themselves do not expect this automated alt text, and it can be really confusing. Okay, so I submitted the issue and waited a bit more, and after about a week, boom, there I go. I raise a pull request with a single commit, remove automatic alt text. Minus 45 lines. Less than an hour later, I got my first comment. This was very exciting. My first interaction with the community. What does it say? I would rather have the option to enable automatically generated alt text. What? But I wrote that very beautiful, comprehensive issue referencing the change in the Rails community, referencing the introduction of the feature. Why do you still want this there? I was very frustrated. This made for a very stressful couple of hours, but this is where the support network came in very, very useful, and fellow open source contributors encouraged me to keep the conversation going and try to understand people's point of view, right? So then I asked, like, how come you want to keep this feature as a thing you can enable? And then the response came from the project maintainer, who explained that removing a feature is a breaking change, which is something that would be released with the next major version. And they were actually okay with the feature being removed for the next major version. So then all we needed to sort out was a way to phase out this feature for the versions in between, so that the users would not have failed validation. So, for example, there are projects who have accessibility validation. So if all of a sudden the old attributes are not there anymore because they're not automatically generated, that will cause many tests to fail for users, and that would be problematic. So that's why we needed a way to sort of like phase out the feature for the middleman users. Oh, I get it now. That makes so much sense, so much more sense. It's all about communication. And communication is hard, but it is very important to be mindful and empathetic when raising issues, when writing comments and writing PR descriptions. It's really important to understand the context and empathize with the community. And whatever you do, do not antagonize the community. It's also good to link to other issues, pull requests, to sort of like help build context and a body of knowledge around the particular changes. And yeah, just ask for clarification whenever needed, no matter how frustrating the whole situation might appear at first. And something that I like to mention, as always keeping in mind for open source contributions, is just think that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. Just assume everyone had good intentions. Now, asking for help if you need it. So it turns out that removing the automatic alt text feature, that commit I showed earlier, did not work. I deleted the code, but the feature was there. The automated alt text was still being generated. And I did not understand why. I recloned the repo. I tried it on a different machine. I tried many things. It was still there. And I needed help. I didn't know what to do. So then I looked towards my friendly neighborhood developer and asked for help. Because, as I said at the beginning, I'm a technical writer, and my coding skills are nowhere near those of a developer. And I asked for help with debugging this issue. And it was a dependency. It turns out that there was a dependency that was also generating automatic alt text. Like, how this almost looks like an epidemic here. Like, what was going on? So my friendly neighborhood developer identified Padrino as the dependency that was introducing the automated alt text again. So then I went over to the Padrino repository, and indeed I found this issue that was asking for a way to generate alt text. And they were also inspired by the Rails community. This is déjà vu. So then I sort of like constructed a timeline that kind of looks like this. So at some point before 2013, the Rails community implements automated alt text. In 2013, the middleman community says, yes, we should do this too, and they do it. In 2016, which is what this issue was showing, the Padrino community also implements alt text. Now, Padrino is a middleman dependency. So even though in 2017 Rails removed the automated alt text, the middleman community might have not heard about it, and neither did the Padrino community hear about it. So middleman had the automated alt text because of its own feature, and also because the feature was also implemented in its dependency. I believe this is what is referred to as the dependency hell amongst developers. So then our approach was to stop middleman from inheriting this automated alt text from Padrino. And we wanted to add an empty alt tag for images that don't have an alt tag specified, because this means that then existing users would also not have their accessibility test fail. And this was a beautiful code change. So what I've shown you before, these are the tests, but the code change itself was a beautiful single line that said, if there is no alt text specified, then add the empty string. So, and having this in there means that middleman no longer inherited the alt text feature from Padrino, which was great. Here it is. We raised a pull request. So the friendly neighborhood developer, Vixu0, and myself, we co-authored this commit. And co-authoring is the way to say we work together on this in the open source community. So if you find that someone offers you some serious help in completing something, it's the done thing to add them as a co-author to the commit. Proper acknowledgement. So then to this timeline, we have added middleman removing automated alt text. Now, it's very important to ask for help if you need it. Where can you find help? With friends or with fellow developers, colleagues from work. You can also post on the open source channel on Slack for help. It's important to acknowledge people's help in the commit, especially if their contribution was substantial, and even if the idea was yours. If someone spends time helping you, it's important to acknowledge this and give credit where credit is due. Because open source is all about community, and that means supporting each other to grow, which is a lovely thing. Now, on the value of open source contributions, I'm going to start from a purely personal perspective, a very selfish one, you might say. Open source contributions are in the public domain. Therefore, this is something you can always refer to as part of your portfolio, for example. You can use them as talking points in your interviews, as part of your applications, and they are a direct proof of your skills, and they also show how you approach issues and how you work as part of a team, right? So for example, if a job description says that experience with Dox's code is desirable, then you could point to a contribution you made to a Dox's code repository to sort of like validate that you have this skill, right? Now, from a community perspective, your contribution takes the community one step further. It helps develop the project. It helps keep the community alive. And to be fair, like the reason you're contributing is because you're making some sort of improvement, right? So you're probably making someone's life easier as well. But what if you're wrong? What if you make a mistake? What if it turns out in 7 years' time that your change wasn't great? That's fine. It's totally fine. We're all human. We're all just as likely to make mistakes. But it's important to keep going and assume that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, resources available, and the situation at hand. So assume the best and always keep an open mind for potential improvements. Now, to wrap up the story, so the middleman automated alt text feature had been removed back in in May. And then 4 months later, I get an email notification saying that someone commented on my GitHub issue about removing automated alt text. My heart sank a little bit, and I was like, oh my God, what happened? Are they going to revert my pull request? That was perhaps a bit unwarranted, because what I found when I went to GitHub was this. It was a very nice comment saying that this is a really great change and very impactful. And I was like, wait a minute, does this person not look familiar? Does it look familiar to you? Do you recognize this person? What about now? This is the issue that asked to remove the automated alt text features from the original Rails project. Of course, remember, he is the accessibility expert who proposed to remove the feature from the Rails project, who knew that I did the same because I referenced his pull request. So he now knows that I used his contribution as an argument for my contribution. And this is part of the beauty of open source. Everything is connected, and it all moves like this. So like big organism in some vague direction towards progress, and it's great. It's great to be a part of that. And overall, it's easy to underestimate contributions to open source. Your pull request gets merged, and that's that. I mean, I had a big smile on for the rest of the day, but that was it, right? But being reminded of this 4 months later, it was so great, and being acknowledged by someone else from the community, someone who'd done similar work, and someone I was kind of looking up to as a model. It's been great, and it's another reason why open source contributions feel so rewarding. So thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoy my story about my first proper open source contribution. I would love to hear your questions and have a little discussion in the Q&A session. And I hope that at least some of you are feeling inspired and excited about making open source contributions in the future. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you so much for coming in and joining us for the chat session after your presentation. Wow, what a journey that was to get to the point where your contribution was accepted. It was quite the narrative indeed, and I really enjoyed how you wove the story, and how when you're dealing with open source, you have to actually engage the community so deeply when you're actually looking at doing like an actual removal rather than an addition. Because so many people go, yes, I'd like to add stuff, but when you think about removal, it's a very different scenario, isn't it?
Yeah. It's about deleting code, and it's about essentially removing someone's contribution.
Yes.
But something that I should mention though is so that contribution stays in the Git history. So like history does record the fact that the person contributed. Now, but like all subsequent changes, that's out of their reach, but it does not erase the fact that they contributed to the project.
Absolutely. That's always on record, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really important. There's no contribution in open source it's ever not a good contribution to make, I think, because it's always there and it's always going to benefit in some way. And particularly for those projects that are long running, it really is inevitable, isn't it, that things are going to change, be removed, and that sort of activity is just part of a long running project like the ones you were working in there.
Yeah, and that's why cross-referencing between issues and pull requests and commits and things. So like when you make your changes, it helps build that trace. It helps build the story around the particular feature and its development. Because now, for example, if you look for automated alt text on a middleman, for example, you're going to be able to trace its story from it being introduced to it being removed and why. And yeah, I think that's quite interesting.
It's almost like it's documentation for your future self or other future selves. It was beautiful in its design, and I really, really liked it. But we did actually get some questions as part of the session, and one of them was actually about your involvement in the community prior to doing the contribution? Were you actually already involved in those communities before you started and made a decision to actually do the fix, or did you really just need to start from scratch?
I really needed to start from scratch, which is why I singled out this experience, because, like I said, this was not a community I knew. I didn't know anyone from the middleman community. It was just a tool that I was using. So I was a user of middleman without having interacted with them before. And this is what made it all the more intimidating to start on. It's because there's this separate group of people that, I need to make contact with somehow.
Yeah. It definitely did sound like it's easy enough to do a change inside the community you're used to being in, but when you do sort of venture outside the walls, that's when it starts to get interesting, because you have to be so much more careful about people's feelings and not offending people so much when you're in a new project. And I think the way you approach sort of familiarizing yourself with the community first was a really important takeaway there too.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, so if you're already part of a community, chances are people already have met you in person, or they'll know your approach to things, your way of speaking and things like that. But it's still generally good to be aware that there'll be new people coming into the community, new people reading what you write in your comments, in your issues. So in general, be mindful and empathetic, and yeah, because it goes a long way and it stays there forever. So,
well, that's a really good point, isn't it? It is on record forever how you actually interact. So it's you do have to be careful, don't you? Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So on setting, if you're doing this sort of work, it did sound like that it went on for a fairly long time. You really did need to sort of, I guess, remain focused in your goal to try and get it done. One of the questions was, what's the best way to set goals when you're doing this sort of thing in open source? Is there a way you can sort of keep your motivation up when you're doing these sort of fixes?
Yeah, so probably my story was an example of how not to do it, because I started off by, working on it here and there. I would sort of browse through the Git history when I had a bit of time and things, because I had loads of things going on. I moved country in the meantime, and there were loads going on. But then it just happened that when the pandemic started, for example, I had a bit more spare time, and then I could sit down. And what I found helped me in terms of taking it to completion once I started working on it is having someone close to me hold me accountable for what I was doing. And in my case, it was a housemate.
Okay.
That, we'd be having coffee and they're like, so how's that open source contribution going? I was like, actually, I need a bit of help.
That's a really interesting way of keeping accountable. It doesn't necessarily need to be someone that's, for example, that you work with or anything like that. It can be anyone that's willing to keep you in check.
I find that it's more helpful if it's someone. The power dynamic is important, because what's my housemate going to do if I don't finish this? But if it's someone from work, then it's the power dynamic is a bit different, because they're either a manager, and then how's their opinion going to change with me? Is my review going to be affected by how I deal with this thing? Or there's a bit more pressure in the work environment because of all the professional relationships and assessments and things like that. So
definitely,
that's my perspective.
No, that's a pretty valid perspective, I think. One of the other ones, you mentioned this in passing, I think, in your presentation about the accessibility checking tool that you're using to sort of find out about the alt text. Does that one in particular ensure that the alt text is not automated in a way, or is it a little bit more sort of, I guess, passive than that?
So I think I might have not been completely thorough when I explained that, but there wasn't an accessibility tool that I was using. So the way we were doing accessibility in that particular job, it was each writer was taking responsibility for accessibility being part of the content that they write. Right. So we didn't have to worry about building the website and the template and things like that, we had to worry about writing accessible content. And that included writing accessible alt text, or not writing alt text at all if the image is described in the main text. So, but in general, I would say it's good to be aware of what your tools do, and even sort of like sensible assumptions that, you know, if I don't put anything between the brackets, then there shouldn't be anything as alt text for the alt attribute. It turns out that that's not true, and that's something I found out by mistake as I was inspecting one of the pages at one point, and I was like, wait a minute, what is this?
Sometimes the best things and the best observations happen purely by accident. That's how all the great scientific discoveries were discovered. Usually it's like, that doesn't seem right. Let's fix that. Yeah, so there you go. It's sometimes doing manual checks and not relying on a tool is actually a better way to find out these things, because you're sort of looking at it more closely rather than just sort of scanning over an error log. Yeah, very good point. And
we were very lucky in that place, because we had like genuine accessibility experts who had been involved in developing the template we were using for documentation and things. So we were starting from a very solid base, but it's very much the principle that you are responsible for what you produce. You're responsible for that to be accessible. So as far as the text that you produce, the images that you add to documentation, make sure that they can be consumed by every category of user.
That's really good. It's good to have that really strong foundation in-house. So you're lucky to have experience with that, I think, and have that sort of as really part of a core principle. Well, I think that might actually be all we have time for from a Q&A perspective. I know it always goes so quickly. I keep saying that every Q&A session, but it always flies. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us again to answer these questions. It's been really great to sort of have this little bit of extra insight at the end of your chat. So that is officially a wrap for Write the Docs. This is the last official part of the proceeding. So thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks Swapnil for the shout out before, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you all for having me.
Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are.
Lovely rest of the day.